So today on the Golden Mean, I have an awesome change maker in every sense of the word. Nina Sanchez is the Director of Enrich Chicago. It's a nonprofit that works with, I think, about 40 arts organizations to end systemic racism. But why Nina's even more impressive, and I've known her for many years, is because she gets both the nonprofit, the NGO side of things, and also politics. She was involved in her local school board. She's involved in national politics. She follows it very closely, so she understands how these levers of power work. And that leads to change faster, or at least I think that makes an individual more powerful in the process. So I also know Nina, she was head of the scholarship and academics at 1 Million Degrees, which is a community college scholarship project in Chicago that I've been involved with for a long time. And I can tell you that in Nina's tenure, she just absolutely changed the entire program. And she was one of the ones who really built the scholarship program at 1 Million Degrees, which provides all kinds of student supports, not just financial aid. So she's someone I really admire. She's a friend. We work together. And it's great to have her on this podcast to talk about everything that's been going on. Thank you, Nina Sanchez, and welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.
I got to take a breath. That's a lot of description. And I probably didn't do you justice. But, you know, we're in this moment, this historic moment, three ways intersecting. But before we go into that, I just gave a just brief description of Enrich Chicago, but tell folks why you're there, what it does, and what you guys hope to achieve and also have achieved so far at Enrich Chicago, because it's a relatively new organization, right?
Yes, it's a young institution. Enrich Chicago started as a grassroots collaborative of arts and culture, but also philanthropic institutions who were really interested in and compelled by a data point that had been published in 2014, which showed that the overwhelming majority of executive and senior leaders in arts and culture institutions nationally were people who identified as white. And this was really something that triggered a series of thinking and convenings for people here in Chicago around what does this data really mean for a city like Chicago that is incredibly diverse and is potentially missing out on an enormous pool of talented people of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, and also other facets of identity who are being potentially excluded from roles in leading and shaping the arts and culture sector in Chicago, which, as we know, is incredibly vibrant. And so they went through a series of processes to really understand what is Enrich Chicago about. And yes, it started from this idea, this sense of being compelled by the data, which showed a racial leadership gap in the arts and culture space, but culminated with an understanding that no amount of pipeline programs or fellowship initiatives were going to solve the root cause of this inequity, which was systemic racism. The ways in which our institutions, all of them, including the arts, are built on a foundation that privileges certain people's identities and ways of being and excludes others. And so they committed to doing that work, starting with their own institutions. And so what began as a set of 9 institutions that included the Field Foundation, Steppenwolf Theater, Montu Dance Company, the National Mexican Museum of Art, among others, is now 40 institutions and philanthropic institutions who have committed to, one, doing their own work as individuals, as individual leaders, and as within the 4 walls of their own institutions, and to collaborate on wide projects. Catalyze this
Sorry about that. There was just a little freeze, so I apologize for the interruption. You know, and I want to go into, again, what's happening right now and how everything is impacting your organization and vice versa. But first, I want to just, you've been motivated on this issue. I think your entire career. You have roots in Mexico and also Pilsen, Chicago. Talk about your inspiration. Talk about why, beyond being Latinx, why this is has been so personal and important to you for a long time, and including at 1 Million Degrees, right? That's part of what you were doing, part of your impetus, yeah?
Yes. My career has been all along by the sense and experience of inequity in my own personal experiences as a citizen in this city, in this country, and also through my educational experiences at some elite and elitist institutions, feeling always compelled by the realization and knowledge that I was experiencing something really through the luck of the draw, right? I worked hard, I did all the things I was supposed to do, but I knew plenty of other people who did everything they were supposed to do, who were smart, if not smarter than me, who didn't access the same opportunities. So I have always been compelled by a sense of wanting to find justice for people like me, my neighbors, my family members, my peers of color at these institutions who so often felt excluded. And so the roots for me have always been in this idea of equity and justice. It began in education because, like for so many, this was a place where change happened for me, where I had access to opportunities that really helped me come into myself, into my own person, to understand the unique values and perspectives that I have to offer. Really started to go beyond that, to first thinking about how do I make post-secondary experiences as meaningful as the ones that I had for other students, to how do I then work with other educators, because I'm just one person. How can I work with other educators and education leaders to understand how they might approach their work through a more equitable and anti-racist framework? And then ultimately, what brought me to Chicago was really desiring to take on this work of anti-racist change in really specific ways, in system-wide ways. And having grown up in a creative household, really understanding the arts as an essential part of our culture, an essential part of our economy, that have been so life-giving and sustaining to me, that it was all of the things that I would be doing anyway, even if I wasn't getting paid to do. So anyone who knew me, once they found out I was going to an organization like Enrich Chicago, said, "Of course you would. Of course, that makes perfect sense." And so now it's really a privilege to be closely connected to the institutions and people and artistic leaders and artists who have so inspired me in my life.
Let's talk about, right now it's Monday, July 6th, just as a timeline here. So it's been more than a month since the George Floyd incident, or since we all watched it. And, the protests, I think everybody has thought have been extraordinary in the makeup of them, in the intensity, in the length, the time, but that's what I want to ask you about. Because when the couple times I was at a protest, or even when I'm watching it, or hearing, on the news, people talking about it, and even many African Americans who say they believe this is a different moment, it's different this time. I think that, cautiously optimistic because of history and knowing the lessons of history and how long it's taken to still not get where we are. But I worry, Nina, about when the protests drop off and it gets quieter, right? I mean, it's hard to sustain that kind of activity, and that's the kind of activity that really drives the change, right? It's the old Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. What are your thoughts about, what we're seeing, and do you worry about it tapering off and losing its power at all because of that?
No, I don't. One, I'll say about these protests that, again, artists were at the forefront, right? They were, so many of the people who I know in the arts and culture space in Chicago were on the front lines, or doing this organizing work in our communities. I think that, yes, people are not on the streets now, but I do see and understand the long-term projects that have been taken up as a result of this moment, this series of moments, right? Because what we had was a global health pandemic that put us all in a very different place and space, spiritually, emotionally, physically, in a way that I would say most of us have probably never experienced in our lifetime, and hopefully we won't ever do that again. Fingers crossed. But also, while we're all sheltering in place, we're faced with a pandemic that existed before the pandemic, this centuries-long pandemic of violence against people of color, right? In all of its different iterations. And there was just something about it or something about this particular, that yeah, it was that final straw for a lot of us. Just because we don't see people on the streets doesn't mean that the work isn't happening. There was work happening before we had these big public manifestations, and there's work that's going to continue. I'm thinking about the work that abolitionists are doing to take police officers out of CPS schools. I'm thinking about the mutual aid projects that have cropped up throughout this whole global health pandemic, that maybe were viewed as temporary, as a stopgap at the beginning, but now are understood to be a part of the ecosystem of these communities, understood to be a place where we build community, sustain community, and take care of community all across different neighborhoods in Chicago. I'm thinking about parenting groups and neighborhood groups that have popped up to say, hey, how do we actually make our own community a more inclusive and welcoming place to everyone? How do we start to break some of these phenomena down that we're participants, that we're being impacted by in our segregated neighborhoods? And so I think it's just going to look different than what we might expect to see. But I think that those people who were there before are doing the work, doing that policy and advocacy work, who were doing the agitation and bringing it to the forefront in media and for the public, they're going to continue to be there. And I would venture to say, I think it's true that there are many more people who are going to continue standing alongside of them.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point, because all that work goes on and it's not on the news. It's not, it's not tragedy. In fact, a lot of it's positive progress. So to that point, you're in touch with 40 or more directors, people running different arts organizations in Chicago. Tell folks how, what the feeling is from them. Do they feel the same way? Are they, is this something that's exciting and that they want to take advantage of and feels like their work coincides with every day and now there's more access to it? I mean, what's the feeling among the leadership that you help through Enrich Chicago?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one, in so many ways, Enrich Chicago, what we're here to do is offer long-term support, right? We have to move beyond the moment. A lot of what we do are these anti-racism workshop and learning opportunities. We always say the workshop is not the work. So what does the long-term support and accountability and community care look like? That's what Enrich Chicago exists to help provide and sustain. And I have to say that this is one of the bravest communities of people I've ever been a part of. And our training partners who we work with will often say, this is a conversation we can have here that we can't have anywhere else. Right? Because there is the work that they did to build trust, to take risks, to put themselves out there in the formation of this, what is now an institution that have gifted us with an ecosystem, a community that is unlike many others out there. I will say though, like with the whole of our society, our arts institutions in Chicago have been dealing with a reckoning. People in our community have been working on this in various ways. I think our learning is that we need to continue doing the work and we need to show our work, right? Because it's actually not just a statement we need to be making. We actually need to demonstrate the long-term commitment that we've made and make that public and accessible to people inside and outside of our institution, so that we're not just playing lip service, but that we're actually doing the work that's required to change our institutions. And some institutions in Chicago, some that are not Enrich members, we've seen these mass resignations of artists and artistic affiliates because of a disjuncture in what institutions say they're doing and they're working on and what is actually happening. And so I think that our leaders, our directors, feel very much that they need to be at the table in even more present ways and even more visible ways than before. They've really opened up to their responsibility in this and are thinking about, how do I actually share the power? I've heard we've had these conversations now. I'm having people say, we need to be doing more. We made the statement, now what are we going to do about the statement? And so they're really feeling a deep sense of responsibility to living into what it is they said they were going to do in the first place. And I think that has renewed for them in this moment. Not that it wasn't already there, but I think what happens to all of us is life happens, right? And because operating in a way that's more equitable, operating in a way that is centering anti-racist institutional values is not the norm for us. It takes work. Sometimes it is not as front and center as it needs to be as we just go about the business of doing life.
You know, as you and I speak, we're coming off 2 weekends in a row of enormous amount of shootings and killings in Chicago. You know, this is a topic that I've written about and worked on, and the numbers were actually coming down the last couple of years, and there's a ton of real on the ground heroes working systematically to stanch that gun violence. And then all of a sudden, you know, it's just 2 weekends where the numbers skyrocketed, and a lot of young kids getting killed.
Yeah.
So I'm not asking this question just because of those numbers the last 2 weeks. However, it does shine a light on what's happening, and it shines a light on it at a time where we're also dealing with all these protests and acts of police brutality and shootings, and you know they're linked. But I want to ask, but when I say linked, the police can help. Police can't solve that problem alone, obviously, but police can help. And so it's a very tricky time, I think, and a lot of people I know who are leaders of organizations like yours agree. Talk about in Chicago how race equity, or rather inequity, plays into a lot of that violence we see, whether it's spiking or whether it's just still steady number of shootings that end up in several hundred deaths a year in Chicago. I mean, this is, see, it's a much deeper issue. And I want to get a take from someone like you who's working on race equity every day.
Yeah, you know, I think when I think about the violence that our communities experience, right, I think it's inextricably linked to poverty, to lack of access to resources, to a sense of dehumanization that is laid over communities of color, and in particular African American communities and Latinx communities. And so when we think about what inequity does to us, it means that we're going to be, if you're somebody who is a person of color, if you are Black in Chicago, you have a life expectancy that is literally nearly 50% that of someone who's living on the Gold Coast, right? Literally, the data shows us time and time again the way that these inequities play out across all facets of our lives. And to me, the violence that is happening in communities is it's an outcome and impact of that inequity, that lack of access, that lack of access to living wage jobs, the lack of access to a community grocery store, the devaluation simultaneously that happens of you as a human being, of the culture your community has and the assets that your community has and brings to the city, a city like Chicago. There's just I think an immense alienation. And so while it may seem counterintuitive to then engage in violence within our communities, it's actually the result of living in a situation that is where your racialization is structured, right? You're structured and you're put into these situations where your agency is limited, where you seemingly begin to work against your own interests because of the way that our racialization and racism has been built into the structures of our society. And so in the same way we would say, you know, why would a Latinx person vote for Trump? Isn't that completely against our own interests? Well, actually, it's the system working in the way that it's supposed to, which would make us believe that, yeah, we can do certain things a certain way and buy access to the biggest privileges that our society would seemingly offer any individual. And so there's a way in which we buy into these ideas and these ideologies that then have us act in a certain way. But frankly, I think that you're right, we can't extricate the structural racism from the violence that's happening in our communities. And I think that the violence is a place where we have some real learning and unlearning to do in terms of a sense of needing to police one another, a sense of how we understand we need to care for each other as neighbors and community members, the ways that we even give room for people to live and be and act differently than we might expect them to live and be and act in our society. So that if we, instead of seeing somebody on the street, sitting in their car because it broke down and they're waiting for their friend to come, and that instead of calling the police because we think they're suspicious, that we might actually approach them and say, hey, is everything okay? I see your hood is up. Can we support you? So I think that those, even those cultural ways of being and those behaviors and those attitudes start to carry into our communities, and we all live through them, we all embody them, we all act out on them, and sometimes in the worst ways, right? In the sense of competition that we bring, the sense of survival that some of us invest in and propagate through violence, physical violence, economic violence, psychological violence, you name it.
Let's pull politics into it for a second, bearing in mind everything you said. I'm curious, after about, 16 months, 13 months, roughly just over a year in office, Mayor Lightfoot, look, this problem, specifically gun violence, but everything you just talked about, it goes deep. It's the history of Chicago and the history of this country and segregation that continues in ways that are not seen but felt, right? They're not a matter of breaking the law, but a matter of, Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote an amazing article, I don't know if you saw it in the New York Times Sunday magazine, What is Owed, basically, I think the title of it was, and talks about all kinds of discrimination that goes on that's not technically breaking the law, right? It's, wink and a nod and that kind of thing. And the mayor came in knowing full well how challenging this would be, and in the face of not, unlimited budgets. What's your assessment of how Mayor Lightfoot has done so far in office on these issues of violence and race equity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that no one person can fix this.
Right.
I think that that's an unfair expectation. Any one person have to deal with, much less than whose own identities sit at the intersections of all the ways that these inequities play out in somebody's lives, right? So we're basically, there's this one false notion that any one leader can fix the whole situation, and then two, this problematic notion that somebody who's been injured by this should be responsible for fixing it. So we need to acknowledge both of those things. I think that there have been some really positive signs of initiatives and frameworks that she's been setting up. I really admire how she's handled this whole COVID health pandemic and her strong leadership in a way that really centered community care in the process of controlling the epidemic, of naming early on the racial inequity in the way that this health issue was impacting our communities, and then pivoting and being nimble in how resources were being invested to support communities for testing and health reasons and everything else. And also with students, and scarcity, access to meals, healthy meals, even while school is not in session. So I think that there's been some really positive signs of her willingness to center community in the process. I think that what remains to be seen is how some of these bigger questions and hopes that people had around her leadership directly connecting to issues of policing and issues of developing and strengthening access to affordable housing. So far, I personally have been disappointed, right, by not living into some of the statements and promises, frankly, that she made on the campaign trail, both around affordable housing, both around strengthening accountability to around policing in our city. And so I think that's a huge question mark. And I know that for many people, this has been a big sense of area of disappointment and wanting to see more from her and her leadership. I think this also points again to the systemic issue. She can only do so much. So who and how has she been bringing people into the fold? And I think that in her own administration, she's done a really excellent job of that. The city's first chief equity officer is a dear friend and colleague of mine, and she's amazing. But again, they had this whole monstrous system that they need to basically organize, right? So what is the agitation that needs to continue to happen there to actually move people who are lifelong, in some cases, lifelong employees of city government, to move them to invest in and explore the ways that they change the way they do business. Because that's actually what this is going to require, that the city is changing how they do business on multiple levels across all of our departments and institutions. And so, again, it's huge, right? It's huge. So that, I think I have some wonderings about, because it's just not clear to me how that conversation is taking place across the whole city government, and not just her administrative team and her administrative leadership.
No, it's a great answer. It's a great answer. It's a thorough answer. And like you said, I mean, that job is just incredibly difficult. I'd say it's the toughest mayoralty in the country. And I thought that when I was involved in the race that she won. It's just, and like you said, one person can only do so much, and has a city council to deal with too.
Yeah.
Right? Last question, just point blank. What can or should white people do? What's the first one or two things that they can do to act right now? They want to act, and I'm not talking about social media posts. You do this every day. This issue is your career. What can white people do? What should they do?
Well, I think the first thing they need to do is be comfortable with not doing anything, right? Especially if you're new to the party, don't become the host of the party. Be a guest a little longer and learn. I think that what gets overlooked, even in the process of institutional change, this again and again to our arts leaders, and in the work that we do with artistic leaders across Chicago, is that it's not enough to change processes. It's not enough to change structures, although that is needed. You can't make this a checkbox situation. There is actually a very deep personal and individual interrogation that needs to happen, so that the culture of your institution can change. And if you don't take time to slow down and think about the ways that you individually are participating in a system of race-based inequity, and take ownership of that and start to unpack that, then all your other efforts will only go so far. And that holds both for white people and for people of color, because we're all complicit in this. We all live here, right? We all make our lives together. And we have no choice but to participate, right? Because we need to survive. We need these institutions to survive. And so sometimes, we're perpetuating these inequities. Sometimes we're disrupting them. But the first thing is, don't host the party, be a guest a little bit longer, turn inward, do that spiritual work that's required to actually be able to step into a place where you can hold space with other people. And then 3, make it your responsibility to work with other white people. There's different work that we have to do, and people of color for too long have had to bear the burden of being the teachers, of being the fix, being the safe. And we have our own stuff to unpack, right? We saw that show up in some really ugly ways in Chicago with the Latinx and Black community around, community watch groups and all of that, and the violence that got perpetuated in some Latinx communities. So we all have our own work to do, and so we need to take responsibility for that within our own communities.
It's a great answer, Nina. You always go deep, and I knew that on some of these answers you would, and I was really looking forward to talking to you as a result of that. By the way, we had a couple freezes in some of your answers, so I might even send you a transcript and you fill it in. So because okay. I'll put some of this out in text when the program is actually posted. We could talk for another hour, and we will another time over lunch and maskless, hopefully, when the world returns. But I really appreciate everything that you're doing. You're one of the most committed people I know in the NGO community, and I know a lot of people in the NGO community. You walk the walk, and I have a huge amount of admiration for what you did at 1 Million Degrees when we were together, and what you've been doing since you basically launched Enrich Chicago in Chicago. So thanks a ton for coming on. I enjoyed it, and I hope people especially listen to that last answer. It was fantastic.
Great. Thanks for having me again, Mike. I always love talking with you. And you're right, we could talk for at least another hour.
We'll do overtime like Bill Maher, right? Thank you for doing this. And everybody, thanks for watching The Golden Mean. We'll see you soon.